Fantastic to see such a brilliant turnout here on a school night. I'm delighted to welcome back Nick Gibb to Policy Exchange, the home of education reform, for the launch of his new book, Reforming Lessons, co-authored with Rob Peal. To our audience tonight, and it very much is a who's who of the education world, Nick will need no introduction. Our longest-serving schools minister, the torchbearer through the years of the education reforms introduced by Michael Gove himself. And our distinguished panel tonight includes some of those at the forefront of those reforms. Daisy Christodoulou, author of 7 Myths About Education. Dean Webster, Executive Director of Secondary Standards at Mercia Learning Trust. Rachel Wolfe, pioneering founder of the New Schools Network. And Rob Peal, author of Progressively Worse and now head of the West London Free School and Nick's co-author on this book. You do not need me to tell you about Nick's outstanding book. He will summarise that and you should buy it at the back and read it. The one thing I would say is that the last part of the title, How This Was Achieved, is as important and as interesting as the first, and it makes this book essential reading for anyone interested in how governments can get things done, not just educationalists. So instead I want to share a personal anecdote on the impact of Nick's achievements. Like Nick, I attended a grammar school, and had you asked me 15 years ago whether I would be willing to send my, at the time, hypothetical children to a comprehensive, I'd have said absolutely not. If I didn't live in a grammar school county, I would have scrimped and saved and done anything necessary to send them to a private school. But today, literally today, my eldest child has just started school at Simon Ball in Hertford, an outstanding rated comprehensive academy with a Progress 8 score of 0.45 that embraces almost all of the evidence-led methods set out in this book. And that I made this active choice is almost entirely due to the reforms brought about by Michael Gove and Nick Gibb, and echoed in the lives and experiences of millions of other children and parents across the country. That is the true legacy of Nick's work. A state school system in which we can be confident more than at any time in the past that all of our children will be well educated. Nick, over to you.
Well, thank you, Ian, for that introduction, and thank you to Policy Exchange as well for the work you did in helping us prepare in opposition and for keeping us on track when we were in government. Tomorrow it's my birthday. It's a big one, I'm afraid, 65. So it's wonderful that so many friends have turned out here this evening for my birthday eve party. So thank you so much for remembering, and if you have forgotten to buy a present, well, please do buy a book at the back of the room. The reviews have been kind and supportive, so I hope you'll think it's worth it. But we're not here to celebrate my birthday, but to mark the publication of Robert Peal's and my book, Reforming Lessons. But we're also here to celebrate the success of so many people in this room and across the country in bringing about a quiet revolution in our schools. For those, particularly those members of Parliament who are present and who generally like to flick through the index of a book before buying it to make sure that they're in the book, I have to say that the indexing program of our book is not great. In fact, it only mentions Michael Gove, Dominic Cummings, and Alison and Rachel Wolfe. So if you want to know if you're in the book, and there are scores of great people who have achieved huge amounts of education in the book, you actually have to buy it and read it. In Guido Fawkes last week, it was revealed through Freedom of Information requests that Bridget Phillipson has had 33 teacher union meetings so far, the first being just 4 days into office. And at that first meeting, Paul Whiteman, the General Secretary of the NAHT, said, we will be offering expert advice. Well, our reforms are based on the expert advice of leading academics such as E.D. Hirsch in The Schools We Need and on the importance of knowledge, Daniel Willingham and John Sweller on cognitive load theory, Daisy Christodoulou and 7 Myths, Ruth Miskin on phonics, as well as writers and thinkers such as Paul Kirshner, Carl Hendrick, Jim Heal, Daniel Muiz, David Didow, and Nick Rose, and of course Doug Lemov's Teach Like a Champion and Barak Rosenshine's 10 Principles. Bridget Phillipson's expert advice is Paul Whiteman. Our education reforms relied on policy development and implementation by at least half the people in this room and beyond. People like Dan Moynihan, Nick Weller, Hamid Patel, Luke Sparks, Rachel D'Souza, Lucy Heller, Michael Wilkins, Max Heimendorf, Bruno Reddy, Chris Bolton, Ed Venker, Michael Wilshaw, Toby Young, Mark Lehane, Catherine Birbal-Singh, Katie Ashford, Joe Kirby, Jonathan Porter, Barry Smith, Dean Webster, Robert Peel, Alex Pethick, Emma Leonard, and Ed Watkins, Tom Bennett, Michael Fordham, Stuart Locke, John McIntosh, Tim Oates, Rob Orme, Jonathan Simons. In maths, Debbie Morgan, Charlie Stripp. In the Minister's office, Theo Agnew, Shahid Ahmed, who's here, Gordon Askew, Bob Bolchin, Diana Bowen, Ian Balcombe, Will Bickford-Smith, John Blake, John Yates, Matt Hood, Clive Wright, Lorraine Lynch-Kelly, Rachel Wolfe, Alison Wolfe, Chris Wilkins, Luke Trill, Amy Leonard. In phonics, Jennifer Chu, Debbie Hebblewhite, Elizabeth Nonweiler, Sue Lloyd, Joyce Watson, Rona Johnson, Sally Coates, Rob Coe, Christine Council, Steve Mastin, Henry DeZoot, Sam Twistleton, and I could go on. And I could go on. And I could go on. Bridget Phillipson's policy development and implementation is delivered by Daniel Kebede and Paul Whiteman. But though it's fun to attack Bridget Phillipson, there are many people on that list, and in this room, and in schools up and down the country, who are on the left and who support the reforms introduced by Michael Gove and me. There are many who are also paid-up members of the Labour Party who are strong and articulate advocates for these reforms, reforms which put knowledge at the centre of the curriculum to counter the Matthew effect, so brilliantly described by E.D. Hirsch in his book. People who support phonics in the teaching of reading and maths mastery, people who support warm, strict behaviour policy and teacher-led instruction. And why wouldn't they support these reforms? The children who benefit most from our reforms are those children from the least advantaged backgrounds. The reforms are evidence-led, and they build on the reforms of previous Labour and Conservative governments, particularly on the work of Andrew Adonis. Sir Robin Wales, a former directly elected Labour mayor of Newham, worked with me in promoting the teaching of phonics in Newham's 67 primary schools. In 2017, Newham was joint first in England for its phonics screening check results, despite being one of the poorest boroughs in the country. There are two people that I didn't mention in the list, and one person in the list who I want to mention again. The latter person is Robert Peel, without whom this book wouldn't have happened. Picture somebody at a desk with a blank piece of paper, licking the end of a pencil, surrounded by piles of crunch-up paper all over the floor. Well, that's what this book would be, but for the brilliance, the organisation and the diligence of Rob. Rob was a Teach First teacher from Cambridge University. He wrote Progressively Worse for Civitas in 2014, and in 2015 spent a year as teacher in residence working with me at the DFE. And he's now joint head teacher at the high-performing West London Free School, a school founded by Toby Young. Thank you, Rob. The two people I didn't mention were first of all David Cameron. You cannot engage in the level of reform that Michael and I introduced, almost all of which was initially highly controversial, without the support and understanding of the Prime Minister. And David really understood what we were doing. Annoyingly, he sacked me in 2012 on the day after my birthday, but he reappointed me 22 months later. In our meeting in number 10, he said, "You know how people talk about bring back matron or bring back hanging? Well, they're now talking about bring back Gibb. So I'm bringing back Gibb." And he later tweeted, "Nick Gibb returns to government as schools minister to ensure no let-up in education reforms," because of course Michael had moved on to become chief whip. And the other person not in that list is Michael Gove, whose energy and drive and intellectual magnificence and political acuity meant we had a programme for reform which he led and which I was hugely happy and honoured to help deliver. Kind people sometimes ask me which reforms that I was responsible for am I most proud. And undoubtedly, the reforms to the teaching of reading top that list. Systematic phonics was rare in primary schools prior to 2010. Now it's in every primary school. And when I first started campaigning for phonics in those opposition years, I was accused of wanting to teach children to bark at text. In 2009, I went to a school in North London just before the election to see a volunteer reading scheme in action. And there I met a 9-year-old girl who could not decode a single word. And she was not a rare example. Now you'd be hard-pressed to find such children still struggling with the basics of reading after 4 years at school. England is now 4th in the world in the reading ability of its 9-year-olds, something to be proud of as a country. Yesterday I had coffee with Natasha Porter, who runs the Teach First equivalent of the prison service, locked-in graduates, and she told me that 73% of the prison population can't read, and that's probably why they are there. Getting children to read is the most important job of an education system, and now the approach to teaching reading is evidence-led and it's working. But I'm even more proud of something else, and that's what's happened to the teaching profession over the last 15 years. The secret garden of education policy and education ideas, once the exclusive preserve of education professors, is now open, and onto its lush lawns are thousands of teachers who write, blog, tweet, podcast, attend research-ed conferences founded by Tom Bennett. The next one's taking place on Saturday. And they publish ideas about curriculum and teaching methods. No longer, thanks to the Academy's programme, does a local authority advisor have the power to block new approaches or evidence-led teaching methods. The free school programme means we have schools like Michaela Community School, Mercia School in Sheffield, Eden Girls School in Coventry, that are delivering high-quality education that top the Progress 8 performance tables. But even more importantly, they provide incontrovertible proof that disadvantage is no barrier to achieving academic excellence. At Michaela this year, 100% of the pupils achieved at least a grade 4 in English and Maths GCSE, compared to 65% nationally. And at Mercia School, 100% of its pupils in an area of disadvantage in Sheffield were entered for the EBAC combination of academic GCSEs, including a foreign language. And 91.5% of those pupils achieved that EBAC combination at grade 4 or above. I'm often asked if I have any regrets in my time in office. And in the latter years of the Conservative government, I do feel that momentum in the reform story stalled. And although I think that what we put in place will largely survive, having learned so much about what works, I regret that we were not able to go further and faster in spreading that best practice into the most stubbornly underperforming schools. I worry that the current government, while being genuine about wanting to improve the life chances of the most disadvantaged, doesn't really have a clue about how to achieve that. And finally, in introducing the book, I want to tell a story that's not actually in the book, but it's one that makes every stress and sleepless night as a minister worth it. About 11 years ago, I was in my office in the DFE ploughing through correspondence when I came across a letter from a 10-year-old girl who had written to the Queen, pleading with Her Majesty, to find her a better secondary school to attend than the ones that were available in her area, all of which she felt had poor behaviour and even worse standards. Buckingham Palace had forwarded the letter to the DfE, and officials had drafted a bland reply about the intricacies of the admissions code. But I noticed the address, and it was in Brent. And by chance, I was due to meet Catherine Burble-Singh later that day. So I held back the letter and discussed it with Catherine, who said that she was sure she could find a place at her newly opened school, Michaela, and would call the girls' parents. The place was secured. Fast forward 7 years, on one of my regular visits to Michaela, Catherine introduced me to the student, now in the sixth form, and I asked her how she did in her GCSEs. Her answer, 9 grade 9s. She went on to study A-levels, achieved A's and A stars, and is now at Bristol University. The book tries to explain the reforms that Michael and I introduced, the what's and the why, and the controversies and the battles that we fought. It also, I hope, provides a blueprint for reform for other departments and also for other countries. Australia has adopted our phonics screening check in 6 of its states, starting with South Australia in 2018, and New Zealand is introducing the phonics screening check this year, thanks to the Education Secretary, Erica Stanford. And as I've mentioned, England is now 4th in the world in reading, and we've risen from 27th in maths in 2009 to 11th last year in the PISA survey. Delegations from around the world are looking at England's story, and they're visiting many of our top-performing free schools and academies, such as the West London Free School, Mercia School, Dixon's Trinity in Bradford, and of course, Michaela Community School. Being a Minister of State for 10 years was colossally hard work, as was working with Michael. But it was worthwhile, and I wouldn't have missed it for the world. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. So that was so interesting. I've written the foreword for this book. So I read it actually over Christmas and New Year. And the theme I chose to focus on in the foreword, if you read it, you'll be able to see, was content knowledge. And not just the content knowledge being important for the education system, but content knowledge being important for policymakers and politicians. Because one of the things that I think really shines through in this book is just how well-informed Nick and his advisors were about education. And that process of being well-informed started before Nick was a minister, as he shows in the book. It started that time in opposition. I think one of the principles is don't waste your time in opposition. And I think that was all a major factor of the success of these reforms. But the theme I actually want to talk about today is the importance of conflict. And conflict sometimes gets a bad name, and consensus often gets a good name. But I think consensus sometimes can lead to groupthink, and I think that conflict actually can be quite positive and can lead to clarity. And I've been really struck over the last maybe year or two how it's almost become a bit of a commonplace. It's become accepted across the political spectrum that the reforms outlined in this book were very sensible and have been very successful. The book's been reviewed in The New Statesman by a former Labour advisor. She said, you know, these are great reforms. Last year, when you had a lot of people doing stock takes of 14 years of Conservative government, English school reform came at the top, or near the top, or at the top of a lot of people's lists. But all of this, I think, really belies how controversial these reforms were at the time. And it's striking to me as well how some of the people saying how sensible these reforms were now were people who 15 years ago were saying they were crypto-fascist. And I'll just give an anecdote to illustrate this. Back in 2011, I was part of the steering group being led by Catherine Burble-Singh, trying to set up what would become the Michaela Community School. And originally it was going to be in Lambeth. And we spoke at a public meeting in Lambeth where people could come along and ask questions about the school. And a handful of retired school senior leaders came along, and I just couldn't believe the amount of grief we got. And I remember going back home that night. I was still living at home, and I got back home, and my dad said, "How did it go?" And I said, "Do you remember?" I said, "You took me to that West Ham match." I said, "Do you remember Paul Ince was on the subs bench?" I said, "And they read out his name, and the guy standing next to us stood up and screamed for a minute. I said it was like that. I said, but there was more foam. So I make this point. The point I'm making is that big successful reforms, they often look very sensible, very obvious, maybe even inevitable in hindsight. But at the time, that is not the case. At the time, they often look reckless, dangerous, crazy, impossible. And those were all things that people said 15 years ago. And I'm sure everybody who's been involved in this journey has an anecdote like that. And I want to give one specific area, which was very controversial at the time, where it was worth having the controversy, in which Nick was combined a real deep content knowledge with the willingness to be controversial. And it's on the slightly arcane topic of nonsense words or pseudo words. And if you buy your book, page 94, here's what we are. These are the pseudo words, right? The nonsense words. So these were words. The phonics screening check has 40 words, tests students on 40 words, and half of them are these made-up nonsense words. And this was a proposal that stirred up a lot of opposition from the sector, and it was in many ways a difficult one to explain to the general public. And it was one that I think bad faith actors could and did misrepresent. And it is a classic example of something that a less well-informed politician would have backed down on, and not only backed down on, but would have been proud of themselves for backing down, and would have seen it as being, compromising, good stakeholder management, building goodwill with the profession. And Nick did not back down, because Nick understood that if you have a phonics screening check with no pseudo words, it is not really a phonics screening check anymore. So this was a controversy that really mattered, and it was a fight worth having and worth winning. And that's what I mean when I say conflict can provide clarity. Because it's really easy to pay lip service to phonics and to teaching knowledge, and to say, of course, nobody's against knowledge. Of course, we all want to teach phonics. But then when you say, well, should we have a phonics screening check where we test pseudo words, people are horrified. So I think by having the conflict and drawing the battle lines, you make it much clearer what phonics is and isn't, and you make it actually much more likely that people understand how it works. And so I think the choice that Nick had here was between the short-term appeasement of some very well-motivated insiders and their organisations, and the long-term benefit of having millions of children read better. And most junior ministers, I think, would have taken the former path, maybe even a lot of cabinet ministers, and that's why 15 years later they're not here sharing their book about how their reforms help millions of children in England to read better and are having an impact on education reform around the world. So the two wider conclusions I would draw from this book are that politicians need to know their brief, they need to have a backbone, and that those two qualities combined are very rare. Thanks.
I've got to start by saying I'm really privileged to share the stage with Sir Nick and esteemed guests. Reforming Lessons, it documents policy and reform that has actually changed lives, and I'm going to try and share that with you. My name is Dean Webster. I was the founder and founding head teacher of Mercia School in Sheffield. Inspired by Mossbourne, lately Michaela, and said, why can't we do this in the north of England? We can. I want to tell you the story of Celine. Okay, Celine, mediocre SAT results, born in England, went to see Celine at the very start of her journey at Mercia. She lived in the notorious Empire Flats. The context, the safeguarding context around that area is drugs, gangs, sexual exploitation. I'm a working class boy from Bolsover, and I'm not often shaken, but going to those flats, stepping over people on drugs, gangs on the corner, really amplified the situation and context of Celine. 5 years later, Celine, at GCSE results day, makes over three grades of progress compared to her peers. She gets the access to do A-levels. If Celine had gone to an national average performing school in Sheffield, she would not have done A-levels. A retired lawyer at 15. Celine, this summer, got top A-level results and is now going to study law at the University of Sheffield. That's how these reforms can make a massive difference for some of the poorest children in our society. And that we should never lose sight of. And that's worth the battle. And I know Sir Nick's ambition there is now reality. So Mercia was actually built on the site of a school that was closed in 2009 because families were not picking it. It only had 400 children there. It should have had 1,000. When it was the 5A star to C, it was below 15% with English and maths. It was closed by the local authority. Same community, different approach, astonishing outcomes. It can be achieved. It's these reforms and this evidence-informed approach that makes the difference. To put that into context, in 2024, the progress of disadvantaged children at Mercia was higher than their peers in the same school, at over +2. So the academy freedoms, what did it allow Mercia to do? Well, we could have the longer school day, finishing at 5 o'clock. We could strip back bureaucracy. Teachers could focus on teaching and take on board all the workload reforms that needed to happen. The school, a knowledge-rich curriculum, which is well documented within the book, direct instruction, a didactic pedagogy, which actually is prescribed across the whole school. Lots of checking of understanding, particularly of your most vulnerable children, to make sure they do understand. Retrieval practice, well-sequenced lessons, assessment that is rigorous from day one, so you build resilience. Character actually happening through the way in which you run the school, rather than a separate lesson, which I see when I go into schools. And all of this under the umbrella of warm strict. Super strict, but extremely warm. Relationships matter. And that's what I see when I walk the corridors at Mercia, but not only Mercia, all the top schools. It's not a coincidence. They all do pretty much the same. And they all do this too. Disadvantage is at its core. It's not a bolt-on strategy. It's not taking a busload of disadvantaged children to a university. What they actually do is they ensure that children are well read. I know at Mercia they read between 7,000 and 9,000 words a day. Compulsory extracurricular, because we know sport is super important, as are the performing arts. And usually in a school, when it's home time, it's the children you're trying to catch that have gone home. Homework at school. We do family dining, so we can hold parents to account for what the children are eating. It's about equalising opportunity. Same for the middle class gel pen girl, same for Celine, same expectations. Mercia is now a beacon for other schools. It has driven local standards for sure. Sheffield must still get better. Multi-academy trusts must align where they've got this great practice and share it and take on board the turbulence that it brings, because it does, especially when you're changing culture. It's very different to creating one. I'd like to thank Sir Nick for all he's given to education and continues to do. I hope, like Celine, many more pupils from our poorest communities, through education, have the chance to escape poverty, because to me, it's the only way I know. Thank you.
Ian asked me to talk about lessons for public service reform, and as I was listening to Nick's typically generous speech in which he named everybody and took very little credit for himself, I thought maybe I would talk about what I've learned from Nick Gibb, who I've known since we were in opposition and I was 22, and I watched him take phonics and all his other crusades through into government and on. And I think he does hold a lot of lessons for other politicians and for reform, and I'm going to go through a few that immediately occur to me. The first is that he knew what he wanted to do and he did the homework. And that sounds so banal. Oh, know what you want to do and do the work. I find it almost impossible to discern from most government departments today, and actually most government departments under the last administration, what fundamentally they are trying to do. And it was always totally obvious with Nick. And he did the work to terrifying levels of detail on how you made that change happen. He visited the schools, he studied the books, he wrote with others the legislation, so that by the time he came into government with Michael, he was able to immediately enact reform, and with speed. I thought Daisy was completely right that a decade ago what was controversial now becomes entirely accepted. And it is often true that yesterday's controversy becomes today's status quo, but only if you move fast and break things in a consistent direction. And it was only because Nick knew what he wanted to do and did the homework that he was able to move fast and break things with consistent direction. The third, which I have changed my mind a little bit over time, is micromanagement. Some of the people in this room have occasionally expressed minor irritation about the way in which Nick managed his department. But I was looking at some of the examples in the book, and indeed his story of the 10-year-old girl. And it struck me that over time, having civil servants know that you were going to go through every single line of guidance, you were going to have a view about which river should go in the national curriculum, and you were going to intercept the letter from the 10-year-old girl or the reply and make sure she got to school, meant that they knew they had to do everything with detail and total intellectual consistency. And perhaps, there you go, I've changed my mind, perhaps it is a good thing to know that your minister will have that level of zeal and attention to detail. But I think tied with that, and perhaps people don't always recognise this about Nick, he did build a system of individuals around him that he trusted completely. He named many of them today, but I was always struck and slightly surprised by the acolytes that he built around him over time, who absorbed all of his ideas, I think gave him ideas in turn, and executed them through the system. I think Nick is possibly slightly less of a fan of school choice than I am, but recognises that one of the things that it has done, the free school programme, the academy programme, is given lots of routes for brilliant and entrepreneurial people to have a vastly greater effect on the system than would otherwise have been possible. Many of them are in this room. There are many others around the country. And I think the extent to which he tried to give them that power was quite impressive to watch. And then the fifth, which, as I think about politics at the moment, I realise is incredibly rare, is in all the time I know him, he had total intellectual and moral integrity and consistency. You were never going to be surprised by what Nick thought. He was never going to betray his principles, but he was also, I think, consistently morally driven and tried and succeeded to transform the lives of hundreds of thousands of people around the country. That is why he has been more successful, I think, than almost any cabinet minister of my experience over the last 20 years, certainly more than any cabinet minister right now. And not only do I therefore think that all the detailed lessons about how you wire the department, how you think about decisions, how you drive through decisions matter, it is also worth recognising that without people who do the work with moral and intellectual consistency, occasionally in excessive detail, not much is going to happen. So thank you. It's been a joy to work with you. I look forward to seeing what you do next.
Okay, thank you all so much for coming along to our book launch. When I arrived this afternoon, Ian asked me to bookend the discussion that we're having by trying to synthesize everything that has been said. And I thought to myself, when I used to teach school debating at the West London Free School, this was always a job that you'll give to a very particular sort of pupil. You'd look for someone who would never bother to prepare, but who you could trust to stand up and bluff their way through. So a sort of overconfident blagger. So I will try to live up to that billing. and reflect on what everyone has said. So thank you for hosting the book launch, Ian, and Policy Exchange, and thank you, Nick, for asking me to help write the book. When he asked me to help 2 years ago, I was flattered and I was thrilled, because 2015, when I worked for him as a policy advisor, you've got a sense of the sort of person he would have been to work for. He was scrupulous, he was incredibly committed and inspiring. To think he's the sort of person who would read the correspondence from a 10-year-old writing to the Queen, really, that does give you an impression. So I had to say yes. And I also felt I wanted to help write the book because I became a teacher in 2011, just a year into when the Gibb-Gove revolution was taking place. And I worked through all of these changes. And I really felt that there is a story to be told. And from the perspective of a head teacher now, I'm a joint head teacher with Ben McLaughlin, who's here at the West London Free School. I think it's a story where schools have gone from feeling downstream of decisions. They used to feel downstream of local authorities and of government quangos and of university education departments who would churn out trainees with ludicrous ideas about how to teach. You then have to disabuse and sort of reteach once they arrived in the classroom. And it's so different now from the perspective of 2025. Leading a school, you feel like you're in the mainstream of the education debate. Schools are now the source of so many incredible resources that are being created, of debates that are happening. Schools now train more initial teachers than universities do, and I wanted a book that could capture how that was achieved. And there's a phrase that we use in the book a bit, which is a free market of ideas. Despite what Nick and Michael's critics would say in the early years of their reforms, they were not looking to turn schools into profit-making schools or to introduce an education voucher system, but they did want to create a school system where there was enough autonomy for schools to try things different, to defy orthodoxies, and to create a free market of ideas. And I think the consequence of this, crucially coupled with really effective and well-designed accountability measures, is good ideas have been able to drive out bad. And you see this every year. Every year this becomes clearer in the summer when GCSE and A-level results come out. I'm going to be a bit secondary focused here, so my apologies to primary colleagues, but whenever you look at those top performing schools, and we've heard about this already, it's becoming undeniable that the schools that are doing best, not just in terms of absolute attainment, but also in terms of progress, are those that have knowledge-based curriculum, teacher-led lessons, high standards of behaviour, and a clear sense of adult authority. Precisely those ideas that were being criticised for being crypto-fascist. That is a genuine phrase that was used in Teach First teacher training. Read the book, it was in there 15 years ago. If you think there are just over 3,000 comprehensive secondary schools in England, about 165 selective schools. And out of those 3,000 schools, the best school in the country for the last 4 years, I think it has been, number one has been Michaela, which we've already been hearing about today. Second best in the country in terms of progress, and fourth best in terms of attainment is Mercia in Sheffield, where I went and visited it a year and a half ago with my friend and fellow teacher Rob Orme, and it was inspiring. It was absolutely incredible to see what you've seen in so many amazing London schools being achieved in Yorkshire. And we haven't quite reached those glittering heights of the West London Free School, but out of 3,000 schools, secondary schools, we were 34th last year, so top 1%. And we've just finished our inset, so you're going to have to indulge me. I'm just going to rehash our inset presentation to the staff. We superimposed our results from this year onto the league tables from last year, which won't be officially published for a few more months, but based on last year, our results this year will have broken the top 10 for GCSE in terms of absolute attainment. They'd have beaten about 50 grammar schools. In terms of our A-levels, 60% of our grades were A's and A stars, and as our Chair of Governors rejoiced in telling staff at Inset yesterday, that's the same proportion as Harrow. Them £64,000 a year, us free, results the same. And all three of us, Mercia, Michaela, West London Free School, so many other schools that you could talk about, we're inner city comprehensive state schools achieving results that 15 years ago many figures in the education department would have never even dreamed of. And they've only been made possible by the reforms that gave autonomy to schools to do something different. And these have allowed teachers who believe that something could be better to actually make that actual. So in conclusion, to end on a positive note, I think fundamentally on this great debate, we start the book with a quote from a speech made by Jim Callaghan back in 1976, where he wanted to launch a great debate about teaching methods, about whether child-centered schools or more teacher-led approaches would be best for children. That debate, I think that debate is now pretty hard to have a firm opinion on one side of, given a well-run school with teacher-led lessons, high standards of behaviour, challenging curriculum, children will thrive. A phrase I love to use, it's one that I first heard Doug Lem of. Many of you would be fans of Doug Lem of, the American educator. He talks about existence proof. And I think now the most powerful way you can change someone's mind about education is send them to a school. Send them to go and visit one of these high-performing schools that we've been talking about. And it's almost impossible after leaving those schools to claim, if you believe in children receiving a good education, particularly the most disadvantaged, that the philosophies that these schools are embodying are in any way wrong or misguided. And that was the orthodoxy 15 years ago. So at the risk of holding hostage to fortune, I think it's very hard to put that cat back into the bag. And no matter, how misguided the things that may happen at the Department for Education may be, as Nick was suggesting, I think it's very hard for that debate to now be to now go back to where it was 15 years ago. And I think that has everything to do with Michael and Nick's reforms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you to all of our panel for excellent speeches, and also, even more importantly, for keeping to time, which means we have space for a small number of questions from the audience. If you could please raise your hand, I will take 3 at once. Meg, over there.
Hi there. Hi, Meg Palchandler, the director of the New Schools Network. The government talks about promoting excellent and drives innovation. At the New Schools Network, we have some concerns that some measures in the school bill might actually stop schools from being able to do that. Nick, you spoke about a lot of the changes being bedded in. Rob, you spoke about the results and the standards that you've been able to achieve with the changes that have happened. What is the panel's view on the schools bill?
Thank you. Lady just there. And then the gentleman just there after that.
Hiya, my name's Matilda Martin. I'm a journalist with Politics Home. My question is for Nick, specifically. Obviously, at the next election, it looks like 16 and 17-year-olds are going to be able to vote, although I know the Conservatives have kind of spoken about that more widely. But Nick, seeing as you know young people so well, I'd like to kind of hear your thoughts on what the Conservatives can do to bring young people back to the party and maybe come out and vote for them at the next election as 16 and 17-year-olds.
Thank you. And then the gentleman, Danny, just there. Sam, just in front of you.
Thank you. It's a question for Nick. Why are you less enthusiastic than Rachel about school choice?
Excellent. I'll turn to a panel. 3 questions. Please don't feel the need to answer all of them, but answer at least one of them. Nick, I will start off with you.
How do you do that? Do you want me to come
If you just answer from the seat, if that's okay.
Super. Meg, the schools bill, I am worried about the schools bill, I have to say. It chips away at the autonomy of academies, and it's that autonomy that has delivered the kind of schools that we've been talking about. They want to make the national curriculum compulsory in academies and so on. They also want to tell schools to expand, even if they don't want to, and one of the things we believe in is that schools should be protectors of their own ethos, and if they feel becoming a 2,000 pupil school is too big, then that should be there preserved. They also want to prevent good schools from expanding when they want to, if it damages the viability of a weak school nearby. And if that is not the way to promote higher standards in schools. But one of the most damaging parts of the bill, in my view, is that we had in the 2011 Act, Michael, you remember, we brought in the direct academy order. So whenever a school went into inadequate under inspection, there would be an automatic duty on the Secretary of State to issue a directive academy order for that school to become a sponsored academy. There are several hundred of such schools now that were inadequate, or requires improvement that are now sponsored academies that are good or outstanding. They are blocking that route now. They're stopping that route. And I think that is a retrograde step if you're trying to deal with that stubborn 14% of schools that are still not good or outstanding. So that's my thumbnail sketch of the bill.
Nick, I would also ask you if you could answer Danny's question about school
Oh, the other
choice.
questions.
Sorry to
Yeah.
put you on the spot.
No, well, yes, the other one about the politics home question as well. I mean, I've often argued and written in the Times a long time ago about authenticity in politics. And I worry about where politics is going, not just in this country, but in a lot of advanced democracies. They're moving to the extremes. And I think a lot of that, I feel, is because of a lack of authenticity by the mainstream parties. That too many politicians in the mainstream feel that they have to play the game of politics. It's all about the media and image and so on. And they don't deal with the reality of dealing with, you know, housing, of dealing with economic growth and productivity and congestion in cities. These are the issues that we should be dealing with. And I think politicians have got to stop behaving like, you know, mini media stars the whole time and just get down to the nitty-gritty. And I think that authenticity will win back young people. And I think it will win back the whole electorate as well. But you know, that I'm deeply depressed about where our democracy is going, I have to tell you. On the final question, I mean, I was sceptical. I mean, you know, thank you for telling everybody that.
I don't think it was that much of a secret.
Well, I'm not now. I mean, I was. I mean, Michael was, you know, really driven by wanting to the Academies programme, and I felt fine. But what really matters is phonics, and what really matters is the curriculum and assessment, exam system, and all these things. And then I realised, actually, maybe Michael had a point, and you had a point, that had we just had my reforms, just had the phonics and the knowledge-rich curriculum and the multiplication tables test and so on, and more, the problem then is that the local authorities, with all the educational establishment people in them, they move from one authority to another. They would have stopped those things from happening in reality. They would have given advice not to. I went to a primary school when I was first an MP, and I said to the head teacher, "Do you teach multiplication tables?" And she said, "Oh no, but maybe I should ask West Sussex County Council if I should." And you know, and you bet your life when she went to ask West Sussex County Council what they think, they would say, "Oh no, it's all rote learning, it's terrible." So that's what would have happened if we'd have had the schools in the state continue to be local authority run. So I came to the view that you needed both, because if you just went down the route that you wanted of just academisation, and yeah, the danger then is you just have a lot of autonomous schools doing the same old, and seeing no standards. So I came to the view very rapidly in opposition. Some of this is in the book, actually, this controversy, this sort of debate, not controversy, debate. I came to the view you actually need both. You need both, and they both need to be turbocharged.
Thank you very much. Would anyone else from the panel like to address any of the points?
Yeah, I'd just say that the new schools bill is that we don't lose. What is the purpose? Let's not lose the great strides that we've made. The Education Secretary is more than welcome into Mercia, or maybe she should visit schools very similar so she can see these strategies and practices that are working, particularly for our most disadvantaged young people. That it's life-changing. And so I'm concerned that the bill itself may detract from that. So that's just something that I'm concerned around in terms of that on the ground, getting into those schools and seeing what they're actually doing.
Thank you. It was something which actually, when I worked with Nick, and I worked with him much later than everyone else in this room, was how much he talked about all the schools he had seen and the sheer number of schools he had been to, which comes through in the book, as well as forming the basis for all of that. It's quite astonishing. I know of no other minister who has visited as many schools as you have, Nick. We may have time for a couple more questions, if anyone would like. Lady at the back.
Thank you so much. Claudia Toma from Teach First. I was wondering what your views were, respectively, on limiting subject choice as a means of boosting attainment in things like EBAC, and whether that is a debate worth having, whether we boost subject choice or not.
Any other questions? Yes, gentleman at the back.
Hello, Harry Hudson, Head of History at the West London Free School. The great work that these reforms has done, I think, needs to be more widely known among graduates who might be considering teaching as a profession. What does the panel think we can do to increase recruitment into what is an increasingly exciting and evidence-based profession? How do we get more graduates from top universities becoming teachers? Thank you.
Fantastic. Great two questions. I'll go to the panel first this time. Rob,
yeah, maybe on the question of recruitment. Thanks for that one, Harry. I'm pleased it was a nice question. I'd put you on cover if it was a horrible one. Increase recruitment, yeah. So I think recruitment is it's something that so many governments struggle to manage. And I think the other end of the recruitment debate is retention. And I think that's probably an easier one to achieve. And actually, if you can ensure that teachers are going to schools that are functional and where they're able to teach and they're not just dealing with, like endless behaviour incidents and that sort of thing, I think that is how we keep people into the profession. I think that on that debate, retention is maybe the better way of resolving it than recruitment. And then on the I forgot on the previous question, so I will move on. On the EBAC, yes, subject choice. So it is true, a lot of these high-performing schools do teach fewer subjects in the national curriculum, and that probably is one of the reasons why they do well. But I think to learn fewer subjects, but to do better in them, is an advantageous thing for pupils. I think that spreading yourself too thinly as a school to try and teach too many things and not doing them well enough, and meaning that pupils don't master literacy and don't master numeracy, I think is problematic. So it's to return to the question about the schools bill. I think having to teach the whole breadth of the national curriculum and having that freedom that free schools were given taken away, that's the thing that I'm certainly most concerned about from it.
Brilliant, thank you. If I could ask the rest of the panel to just pick one of the two questions, that would be great. But thank you anyway, Rob.
I'll take the subject choice one. When I started teaching in 2007, the main accountability metric for secondaries was 5A star to C plus English and Maths. And in practice, what you could do then was do English and Maths and a BTEC, which was worth 4 GCSEs. So you had students, quite significant numbers of students, who for the last 2 years of secondary were basically doing English, Maths and a health and social care BTEC. You're now in a situation where the main accountability metric is Progress 8, which incentivises doing 8. So for all the talk of reducing subject choice, in my experience, I'm still in touch with friends at that school, those students are now doing more subjects, not fewer. So I know EBAC, people say it's reduced the number, but actually in a number of places it's actually expanded what students do.
If I just follow on from that, Tim Loynick, who's over there, I think would say two things in response to most policy questions. The first is, if you're a massive outlier from other countries, it's useful to ask yourself why. And most countries are pretty clear about what subjects they want their students to do, in fact to 18, not just to 16. And it would be remarkable to them, the idea that you didn't need to do maths, English, science, history, foreign languages as a base. And I still don't understand why we think we are different in that way. So I do think that is incredibly important. And then very quickly, I know you said one, Ian, I'm ignoring you. On recruitment and retention, two quick things. The first is pay does matter, and I thought it was fantastic what John Coles did when he looked at moving pensions into pay. It should be celebrated. We absolutely need to look at how we do things like that to retain people. I also think we should recognise that the period when Nick and Michael and others and Daisy and I were first involved in education followed off from the Andrew Adonis period, where there was a real sense of glamour and excitement in education. And Teach First, I think, dragged people in from the very top universities because it felt like the place to be. I think we've lost that totally. And if we are going to regain education reform, we need to make it glamorous and exciting again in exactly that way.
Yeah, sure. So I thought I'd pick up the recruitment and retention. I just think for teachers, I remember a few years ago, school leaders would do things like yoga on a inset day or whatever. Teachers just want to have better behaviour. That's it. That's their well-being straight away. They don't want the workload of things that don't matter that a head teacher gets them to do to show the governors or the trustees. It's quite simple. If teachers can just focus on teaching, then we will retain more teachers, I'm sure, so that they get involved for the vocation of teaching. That's why they chose to do it. And so schools, if they keep it simple and create the conditions for that work, and it's centre-led with that warm strict, I think you'll find that in those schools that do that, they do retain staff. They do that. In terms of the EBAC, so at Mercia, because we have the longer school day, for example, we've got a broad balanced curriculum. We actually meet all the national curriculum. If we wanted to game the system, we would have done everyone do perhaps religious studies or everyone just do a double science. We don't do that. So it's never been about the league table. It's been about the opportunities and the doors that those grades open for those children for their futures. And so the very best schools do that. Okay.
Nick, any?
Well, I'll just make one point about the EBAC. I think the EBAC is about social justice because middle-class kids, their parents would expect their children at their private school or at their grammar school or at their comprehensive in the leafy suburb to be taking maths, English and English literature, to taking at least 2 sciences, probably 3, to do history or geography, and to do a foreign language. They would assume nothing else. But we somehow assume that if you're from a disadvantaged background, oh, you know, foreign languages are not really for you, and you should just do the core science. I think that's reprehensible, and it's why Michael and I introduced the EBAC performance measure, because it is a matter of social justice. It's a pity that it's only gone from it was 22% were taking that combination in 2010, 15% were achieving it, 8% were taking it to disadvantaged children. That 22% has gone up to about 40%. And it's a pity it's not gone further. I think we should have had more emphasis on it. And I hope to goodness that the curriculum and assessment review that we're waiting for the final report from doesn't try to undermine the EBAC, because if they do, they will be undermining the opportunities of the most disadvantaged children in our society. And on recruitment, do you want me to say something about that or not?
If you would like to.
Well, you know, it was one of the biggest challenges of my job, the whole period. It's not exclusive to this country, the challenges of recruitment. It's happening internationally. Pay is obviously an issue, and every time we had these discussions, I would be battling. You probably didn't know this, Michael, but I'd be battling for more money for teachers. But and I'm sure you agree with me anyway, Michael. But all those other issues that we brought in the early career framework to try and help young teachers starting in the classroom who'd not had necessarily good training in the universities. We gave them better mentoring, evidence-led teaching, 8 different standards about behaviour, about knowledge, how to teach the subject, and so on, to help them survive in the classroom. 12%. Are leaving every year who just started teaching. You're right, retention is almost more important than recruitment. So we introduced the early career framework, and I think that will in time have an effect on retention in our schools.
Thank you very much. Now, before we move to the formal vote of thanks, I have just 2 very brief things to say. The first is that Nick has very kindly agreed to stay and to sign copies of his books at the end, so you have no excuse not to buy one if you haven't already. The second is that there are some other people I would like to thank, and those are our fantastic events team led by Emily and Lucy, who have made this event what it is. And the second is to our director, Lord Godson, and managing director, Julia Mizzen, who, even though they can't be here today, make Policy Exchange what it is today. And without further ado, And without further ado, I'm delighted that we have someone who was not mentioned on the programme, but we are absolutely delighted who could come, the outstanding reforming education secretary of our time, Michael Gove.
Success has many fathers. When members of the 2010-2015 government are asked, what was the biggest success of that time? Then David Cameron will say, education reform. George Osborne will say, education reform. Nick Clegg will say, education reform. And when you ask people who were also observers of that time, what were the big successes of those years? then even Bridget Phillipson will say, well, actually, education reform. And while success has many fathers, and indeed, to coin a phrase from Jeremy Corbyn, there were many people who were present, there were only a few who were directly involved. And if you want a real paternity test of who the father of school reform was, then the DNA shows us that it was Nick Gibb all the way. Nick was there before anyone else when he chose to be on the Education Select Committee, and he did what so few MPs do. He sought out the evidence to explain why it was that our students were underperforming relative to their peers elsewhere in the Western world. The work that he did on that select committee changed government policy at the time and changed the nature of the debate. And that's why David Cameron made him our school spokesman in opposition. And then when I was appointed to join the Shadow Cabinet and to be the Shadow Education Secretary, it was Nick who was the master craftsman who took me as his apprentice and introduced me both to the policy detail, but also imbued me with a sense of moral purpose that has always animated him. People sometimes ask me what it is that they should do if they're interested in a career in politics. And I now have the answer. Read Nick's book. Because it tells you actually everything that you need to know about how to be a real success in politics. Because Nick, throughout his career, has had a sense of moral clarity about what matters. He looked at the education system not from the prism of an ideologue, not because he wanted to generate eye-catching initiatives with which he could be personally associated, but because he saw that there were real problems in our country that required radical change. That students in our country were falling behind their international peers. And this wasn't just a matter of national machismo. It meant that children in this country would have narrowed horizons and fewer opportunities as a result of the changes that were occurring elsewhere. And in particular, Nick was moved by one thing, which is that even as we fell behind other nations, the gap between rich and poor in our education system was growing with every year that passed. And Nick's belief was that if we looked at what high-performing countries achieved, those countries which actually ensured their children were being equipped with the knowledge and the skills to master the future, those countries where the gap between rich and poor was capable of being narrowed, and we applied those lessons here, and we also sought to understand what the rationale behind those changes were, looking at brain science, looking at curriculum, looking at the way in which the very best teachers were recruited and capable of motivating students. If we applied those lessons here without ideological blinkers on, then we could ensure genuine progress. And it was that moral clarity and that willingness to sweat the small stuff, as Rachel has reminded us, that determination to ensure that the detailed aspect of how policy comes together, how it could be applied, and how it could be implemented was pursued with sleepless determination. It was that which ensured that Nick was the indispensable partner of a succession of education secretaries, myself, Nicky Morgan, Justine Greening, Damien Hines, and others. And it was also the reason why Nick was in the government of so many prime ministers, because they recognised that Nick was the type of politician whom others could learn from and whom everyone could admire. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you to Nick for what he's done, because ultimately Nick's achievement is not this wonderful book, which I urge you all to read. Nick's achievement is that there are hundreds of thousands of children in this country who have better and brighter futures because this guy believed in doing what was right. And there are people in this room, civil servants who worked with Nick, politicians who've grown to admire Nick, and people who have had their lives and careers touched by him, who know what I'm talking about. And Nick, you should be immensely proud of what you've achieved. You're a hero. Thank you.